Hello, class, um, and good morning, afternoon, evening, or in my case, very late night. This is my presentation on all the interesting things that I learned doing my exegesis on Matthew 24, 32 through 44. I'll get to what these scriptures say specifically, but first I wanted to relate a bit of a story about what these scriptures teach. Throughout Matthew 24, Jesus is teaching his apostles about primarily two things. First, the destruction of Jerusalem, which is right around the corner, and second, his second coming. I titled my paper Like a Thief in the Night because it includes the scriptures where Jesus is referring to his second coming as a thief that would come in the night. Um, while this analogy, like everything that Christ teaches, is perfect, I think another analogy that could be used that if Jesus, while talking of his own second coming, said his second coming would be like the paper presentation in apocalyptic literature, or Newt 7910, that is due June 21st, but Brandon thought it was due the last week of class, so when he got back from a camping trip and logged into Canvas for the first time in several days, saw that it was due the second to last week of class, and so was dreadfully unprepared and stayed up super late into the night to get it done. I think that also would have gotten his message across pretty well. Before I dive into what I learned, I wanted to read the section of scripture. I get into why this is kind of a big deal for me in the next couple of slides. Suffice it to say that I like to start exegesis with the actual scripture. Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender, he putteth forth leaves. Ye know that summer is nigh. So likewise, yea, when ye shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the door. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Then shall two be in the field, the one shall be taken and the other left. Two women shall be grinding at the mill, the one shall be taken and the other left. Watch therefore, for ye know not the hour the Lord doth come. But know this, that if the good man of the house had known in what watch the thief would come, he would have watched and would not have suffered his house to be broken up. Therefore be ye also ready, for in such an hour as ye think not the Son of Man cometh. In the paper, I relate this to my own life, speaking of an experience I had a few years ago. I'm in the military, and before being stationed here in Missouri, I was stationed in Pyeongtaek, South Korea. When I arrived, I was instructed to get my military gear and put certain items into a bag. I wasn't told the reason, just that I needed to have that bag ready as soon as possible. After the first little bit in my new unit, I was woken up in the middle of the night by a phone call, and it was someone telling me, basically, this is an exercise. North Korea has launched missiles into Seoul, South Korea. You have 1 hour to report to your unit with your essential equipment. I showed up and showed them all the necessary gear and got my name written on a piece of paper. Then went home and slept for another 2 hours, then woke up and went to work. If I weren't ready by not having my bag packed, my name would have been written on a different list, and I would have had a talking to by someone very important who would have had some choice words for me. While reading this section of scripture, I was able to relate this to my own personal experience on multiple levels and creating my version of a parable. It was extremely beneficial to help relate the scriptures. When reading through the scripture section, I looked at it through five different translations. One of the most noticeable difference between them was that the American Standard Version references the fig tree as female, while every other translation uses a gender-neutral pronoun, or his. I found that very interesting, so I began to research as to why that is. In the end, I was able to find an article that discusses how many ancient Jewish traditions have links between trees and people, but nothing that explained why only one translation called the fig tree a she. It is possible that it piqued my interest because this has become a bit of a hot topic button, or a hot topic button in pop culture, and possibly because my children have started asking about their own pronouns. In the end, I chose to use the King James Version of the Bible. As I stated before, there wasn't a huge difference between the different versions. However, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in America typically use the King James Version, so it is the one that I am most familiar with. And this version is the one that I use both for my personal scripture study and the one that has the most notes taken in it from when I took seminary. As far as context go, I'll be breaking it down into historical and literary. For historical, as with most things in Jesus' life, theologians can give a pretty good estimate as to when they happened, but when it comes to actual hard this year, there's some wiggle room or some room for interpretation as to when they believe these things actually happened. Matthew 24 is very close to the end of Jesus' life, and because of this, most theologians place it around 30 AD. I have read some religious texts that argue that Jesus was born closer to 8 BC, and later in that same book said it's possible that he was born closer to 5 AD. So as I said, there is no definite answer as to the exact date, but it should be somewhere around 30 AD. The location is just as difficult to discern. He left the temple and was on his way to the Mount of Olives with his disciples. However, the Mount of Olives is not a mount. It is a series of mounts, as you can see in the picture that I placed on this slide. For literary context, Jesus in this section of scripture is preparing his disciples for his departure. Jesus is taken just 2 chapters after this. Perhaps he wanted to give them a bit of comfort, letting them know, like, I'll be back once much sooner than you realize. But he will also be back again when they least expect it. Jesus in this section, my apologies, for form and structure, Jesus in this section jumps back and forth a bit, but that makes a lot of sense because he's tackling 2 pretty big topics. First, the destruction of Jerusalem, and second, his second coming. He starts with a parable of a fig tree, and then goes on to talk about the future. So he switches from parable to prophecy. He then goes into the story of Noah, turning that into a parable as well. Then tells 2 more stories using them as parables, before ending with more prophesying. This section of scripture can be broken down into 5 different parts from my periscope that I have listed on this slide. Out of the 5 different sections, parable of the fig tree, not all things pass, Noah and the flood, 2 become 1, and watch for the thief. All of these can be interpreted as parables, except for not all things pass. And in between those different parables, Jesus is prophesying. So once again, showing that he jumps back and forth between those 2 styles of teaching, prophesying and telling parables. For the commentary on the body, one extremely interesting point that I found while researching these individual verses was why Jesus would teach the way that he did. When teaching parables, he would almost always use agriculture in his stories in some form or another. When teaching parables, he would do this because this is what the people knew. Most of these people weren't necessarily farmers, but would have some gardening experience. However, this is especially true when talking about the parable of the fig tree. People knew the fig tree. The fig tree is cultivated all over the place in Israel. It is often planted in front of people's houses. So while we read this thousands of years later and in a country on the opposite side of the world, if you're like me, you'll think after reading, when his branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, you know that summer is nigh. I thought, oh, I guess fig trees put on their leaves when it's close to summer. This is something that was common knowledge among the people in the location of time, in their location and time. So Jesus was using it when people knew fig trees. Another thing I learned is that when there are many individuals who believe in the Bible, but do not take these scriptures to heart, this section of scripture. What I mean by this is there's an entire section of individuals who attempt to set a date as to when Christ will come. Many articles and books that I read refer to these people as date setters. Date setters. Christ told his disciples and everyone that will end up reading the Bible but of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. In addition, if his second coming will be like a thief in the night, we won't know until it's basically on top of us. To add some context or go into this analogy a little bit deeper, if we are watching for a thief and we notice an unmarked white van drive past our house a few times, maybe that is a sign that a thief is coming soon. When you see a man in your backyard with a crowbar, that is a sign. So you need to remain ready with locked doors and a security system. Not when you see the thief, but long before that, you need to remain ready. But the existence of date setters is nothing new. From research in this class, we read that around 1000 AD, people started assuming that Christ was on his way. They remembered that he talked about a millennium. So people were wondering, wait, was that 1,000 years after his birth or after his death? At any rate, it's going to be within the next 30 years. In our reading this week, we learned that people were getting ready for his second coming and needed, in the New Testament, and needed to be reminded. There are going to be many signs for us to watch for. Don't do anything drastic and assume the second coming is around the corner. In the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we have been advised by our leaders to live our lives as though we won't live to see the second coming, but always to be ready for it. In other words, don't pass up having kids or getting into a career because the second coming is just around the corner. Live as though you will die of old age. But, as we are counseled in the scriptures, always be ready for it and always watch for those signs. So my biggest takeaways from doing this exegesis, I learned so much. Exegesis are always very interesting because you read about, you read these scriptures over and over and over again, but once you really do a deep dive, you're like, have I ever read this before? There's so much context that I just did not realize before doing a deep dive into it. One of the biggest takeaways for this exegesis was actually the format. I've only done a handful of exegeses so far in my master's, but each one has had a different format and breakdown. I've never had an exegesis that doesn't have the entire scripture written out at the very beginning. While it may seem like a small thing, I think that changed the entire feeling of the exegesis. Granted, I started the paper by reading the passage well over a dozen times, and I basically had it memorized. But there is a difference when you actually write it out word for word. I'm not sure if I can explain why that is so different, but it did have a different feel to it. Another huge difference is that I have never done a pericope like the one that we did for this paper. While writing it out does give the paper a different feel, the pericope, I think, makes up for that in some ways. Dissecting the story into its different sections, and then dissecting those sections into their verses, and then dissecting those verses into separate parts. You have to think deeply about the meaning and intention of not only the verse, but each word they chose within each verse. However, I think the biggest takeaway from this paper is I've always read this chapter just thinking about how we should watch for the second coming, because we are told to. But Christ is teaching that, yes, we should watch for that day, and we should watch for the signs that precede his second coming. But more importantly is that we remain ready for his second coming. It is going to come when we least expect it. So if we live our lives to be always ready, it won't catch us off guard because we'll be still in a state of readiness. Just like my story with North Korea. When I was in South Korea, I always had that bag packed. So when if North Korea attacked, we would all be ready for it. All right, like I said before, I learned so much from this exegesis. It was a great opportunity to do another deep dive into the scriptures and take it apart and learn things that I had never realized before. Thank you for watching.